climate change has such broad impacts that there's scarcely any aspect of our day-to-day lives that climate change will not affect.
Climate change is not maybe something that's happening in the future. It's happening now, and we're dealing with its implications.
The climate is changing primarily because of the addition of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere that results from the burning of fossil fuels. Greenhouse gases are gases that make it harder for the Earth's cooling mechanism to operate. They make it harder for the Earth to give up its heat to space. And as those concentrations of greenhouse gases have increased, the world has warmed. Over the course of the last 50 years or so in New Jersey, temperatures have warmed by about 3 degrees Fahrenheit on the average. Since 2000, many of the warmest calendar months for that particular time of year, whether it's winter, spring, summer, or fall, in over 125 years of data have happened recently. So we are seeing many more extreme warm events, fewer extreme cold events.
We know that moderate and extreme heat events, they cause a series of heat-related illnesses, and as climate change increases, these risks will only increase. Heat waves are particularly impactful in urban areas because urban areas have a lot of buildings and pavements which absorb solar radiation, and that just makes it much warmer in these areas than, say, rural areas which have much more vegetation. During the day, the difference might be up to 6 degrees, but at night, that difference can be up to 22 degrees warmer in an urban area than a rural area. In urban areas, high heat also increases ground level ozone. And ground level ozone is a lung irritant. And this, of course, is associated with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and asthma. So in New Jersey, we have data that show that we see an increase in pediatric emergency room visits during these warm seasons.
Another impact of climate change is increasing heavy rain events. That under climate change, we've seen about maybe a 30 or 40% increase in the amount of rain that falls on the heaviest rain days here in New Jersey. And that's a trend that we expect to be associated with climate change because as the atmosphere warms up, it has the capacity to hold more water vapor. And so when the weather conditions are right to make that water vapor form clouds and rainfall, the rainfall we get is heavier.
So heavy rains and more intense rainfall have a series of cascading impacts. These can range from death due to drowning, and we see also contaminated water, which can result in gastrointestinal illnesses. We can see asthma from mold that will grow in people's homes and in their basements due to floods. Flooding disrupts power, it spoils food, it impedes our access to healthcare and pharmacies, and we suffer from lost work days. And relocation and impacts to homes can take a severe mental health toll, especially on children.
Another impact of climate change that we feel here in New Jersey is sea level rise. That as the Earth warms, sea level rises for a couple of different reasons. First of all, when you increase the temperature of water, it expands. So even the same mass of water in the ocean will take up more space if that water is warmer. But in addition, warming has caused melting of glaciers in the mountains around the world, ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica, and that melting adds water to the ocean. In addition to at the same time the ocean is rising, the land is sinking. And so that means here in New Jersey and along much of the mid-Atlantic coast, it's a hot spot where sea level rise is even greater than the global average. But the bulk of that sea level rise is coming from climate change. Climate change is going to have a variety of impacts, some of which are hazardous. The nature of those hazards may depend on exactly where you are. Sea level rise produces big impacts in coastal communities or communities that are on estuaries like the River Estuary or the Delaware River Estuary. And a lot of those impacts are associated with storms. We all remember Hurricane Sandy as a big storm event that produced unprecedented devastation along the coast. But as sea level rises, it won't take storms as intense and unusual as Hurricane Sandy to produce the same levels of flooding that we saw with Sandy.
Sea level rise, we actually don't need to have a storm to have tidal flooding. We now are seeing what we call sunny day flooding or nuisance floods. These happen at the highest tides of the month and sometimes multiple times a month. And in New Jersey, we actually used to have, in the 1950s, we had about one, on average, sunny day flood a year. Now we're seeing on average 8 of these sunny day floods a year. And in the next 5 to 10 years, we're predicting that we're going to be seeing double that amount of these sunny day floods.
In inland communities, freshwater flooding or flooding from rivers and streams is a comparable hazard. In the last 25 years or so, we've seen Hurricane Floyd, Hurricane Irene, Hurricane Ida, all of which produced intense flooding events here in New Jersey. And in the case of Ida, where those heavy rains happened in a short period of time, also, unfortunately, a lot of loss of life as well. So flooding hazards from the ocean in coastal communities, from rivers and streams in inland communities are a big part of the increase in hazards we may see in the future.
Planning board members actually have a very, very important role in helping communities minimize the impacts of climate change and plan for a much more resilient future for their communities. Specifically, planning board members have an important role in preparing the municipal master plan. And that municipal master plan was recently, the requirements for that was recently amended to require a climate change related hazard vulnerability assessment to be part of the land use plan element of the municipal master plan.
The municipal land use law that now requires that we look at climate change as part of the master planning process. The master plan is a document that speaks to the community's vision for the future, how they want it to grow, where they want it to grow, and things of that sort. So now it's taking a climate change lens and looking at it through that. So that we're looking now at, oh yeah, we want the city to grow, we want economic development to be increased and spurred on, but we also want to take into account that there are parts of our city that are very vulnerable to flooding.
It's important to consider not just climate change from the perspective of flooding, sea level rise, and high heat in your community, but it's important to consider the people in your community, the people who are most vulnerable to those risks and impacts.
Within each community, when we're looking at the vulnerability to impacts of climate change, there are areas obviously that are more vulnerable than others. And it's important that the municipality and the board take that into account. Far too often, unfortunately, there is a correlation between these areas of high vulnerability and areas of limited economic means. And so when these impacts do unfortunately take place, then it makes it that much more difficult for that area or part of the community to respond and come back from it.
Populations vulnerable to climate change include the elderly, they include children, but they also include folks whose vulnerabilities are shaped by inequalities associated with their race, their immigration status, and also people who are physically or cognitively challenged. And often these are people with limited access to health care or don't have health insurance. And in New Jersey, we actually have a legal definition of overburdened communities. These are census blocks where 35% or more of the population is low income, or where 40% of the population identifies as minority, or where 40% of the households have limited English proficiency. We have very good mapping tools here at Rutgers, and that we use these mapping tools, our NJ Adapt tools, which enable us to identify where those overburdened communities are in relation to flooding, in relation to extreme heat, in relation to urban tree canopy. And these are things that we can use to help us identify those vulnerable communities and to make interventions to address them.
A climate change-related hazard vulnerability assessment, or a CCR-HVA, is probably one of the most significant new amendments to the municipal land use law. And all planning board members and even zoning board of adjustment members should be aware of what a CCR-HVA, or a climate change-related hazard vulnerability, is, and the important role that it plays in the master plan and land use planning policies.
There is a document, the Climate Change Related Hazard Vulnerability Assessment, or better known as CCR-HVA. That is basically a mandate through the municipal land use law that requires that master plans now include an element that looks at this particular phenomenon. How is climate change going to impact the community? So that we would look at aspects of climate change in housing, aspects of climate change in land use planning, aspects of climate change in transportation, and things of that sort.
But essentially, what a climate change-related hazard vulnerability is an assessment of the hazards that are affecting the community related to climate change, an evaluation of the community's critical resources that are needed to respond to and sustain the quality of life after a natural disaster or storm event, a review of the various land use policies in the community, and an evaluation of development regulations within the community to determine whether or not those land use policies, i.e. the zoning, needs to be changed, or the land use policies of the community, and specifically development regulations, to make development much more resilient and less prone to be adversely impacted by climate change related hazards. And then finally, and probably the most important aspect of the climate change related hazard vulnerability assessment from a planning perspective is two things. The first is that the climate change related hazard vulnerability assessment has to state its relationship to the other elements of the master plan. Finally, there is also a statement of relationships to other planning documents, such as a hazard mitigation plan, the emergency operations plan, capital improvement plan of the community, the stormwater management plan of the community. It requires members of the planning board to look at their communities more holistically and what are their land use planning policies over a broad range of community goals and objectives to ensure that the community is resilient and less adversely impacted by climate change related impacts.
So what exactly does this assessment have to include? I'm going to try to summarize what's involved. And you'll see it's a lot of stuff. Roman 1, the assessment has to include an analysis of current and future threats to and vulnerabilities of the municipality associated with climate-related natural hazards, including but not limited to increased temperatures, drought, flooding, hurricanes, I'm going to add tornadoes, but it doesn't say that, and sea level rise. Number 2, include a build-out analysis of future residential, commercial, industrial, and other development in the municipality, and an assessment of the threats and vulnerabilities identified in Roman 1. Identify critical facilities, utilities, roadways, and other infrastructure that is necessary for evacuation purposes and for sustaining quality of life during a natural disaster. Number 4, analyze the potential impact of natural hazards on relevant components and elements of the master plan. Roman 5, provide strategies and design standards that may be implemented to reduce or avoid risks associated with natural hazards. Roman 6, include a specific policy statement on the consistency, coordination, integration of the climate change related hazard vulnerability assessment with any existing or proposed natural hazard mitigation plan, floodplain management plan, comprehensive emergency management plan, emergency response plan, post-disaster recovery plan or capital plan. Roman 7 is rely on the most recent natural hazard projections and best available science provided by the NJDEP. Another question I'm asked, is there any special requirement for adopting the assessment? For example, does it have to be subject to a public hearing? The answer to that is easy, because an assessment is an element of the land use plan element of the master plan. To adopt or amend the master plan, a public hearing, a duly noticed, on 10 days notice, public hearing must be held.
The community has an important role in creating an effective climate change-related hazard vulnerability assessment and plan to address climate change. Typically, that process includes public hearings and ideally extensive community engagement in the process. So what we want to do is engage the community in assisting the planning board in crafting a master plan that responds to community's needs and implements the community's vision for its long-term development, redevelopment, or preservation. We just recently did an update of the master plan in the borough of Haddonfield. And as part of that process, we had some extensive community engagement meetings, including surveys and an extensive outreach process to stakeholders. As part of those community engagement meetings, we had members of the community identify areas where they were experiencing flooding. And when we compared that to some of the historical data, we found that there was some alignment, but then there were areas that the community was experiencing flooding that didn't come up in the data and mapping. So you need to have that engagement, because it's not only just ensuring that the community accepts the recommendation, but they provide valuable information for planners and the members of the planning board. Once a planning board has adopted a new master plan and a new land use plan element that contains a climate change related hazard vulnerability assessment, once that's adopted by the planning board, it now becomes part of the official master plan of the community. The next step really becomes one for the governing body of the community. The governing body then has the responsibility to adopt any ordinances or amendments to existing zoning ordinances that implement the recommendations that are contained in the climate change related hazard vulnerability assessment.
One issue is governing body decisions regarding zoning of property and the ordinance, whether or not to amend the ordinance to include any of the design standards that are supposed to be part of the assessment, or change zoning of certain property because maybe it's prone to flooding. Maybe you want to decrease or increase the lot size, decrease the density, have standards, design standards that could say the floor area of any building or structures has to be elevated at least X feet off the ground, something like that. If the governing body implements these by ordinances, that means that every single development application in front of a planning board must comply with them.
So that's at the planning board level. The zoning board of adjustment level, if in fact an application is requesting a D variance or use variance or some other D variance, the applicant has the burden to present both the special reasons for the application as well as the negative criteria. In evaluating the special reasons, the applicant's burden is to show how that request for a variance is in fact promoting the goals and objectives of the community through the effectuation of the master plan and through the effectuation of the climate change related hazard vulnerability assessment. And the negative criteria, the applicant has the burden to prove that the application is not having a substantial detriment on the public good or substantial impairment to the zone plan. Well, if you're looking at climate change related impacts, if the applicant has the burden then to show that in fact that application is not having a substantial detriment, i.e. is not creating more climate related impacts, or is being developed in a vulnerable area. So the board has a standard to review if in fact a climate change related hazard vulnerability assessment is included in the community's master plan.
Climate change has required us to rethink the way we plan for the future. In a climate that's unchanging, we could assume that the future was going to look more or less like the past. And the more data we had about the past, the more we could evaluate how to prepare for the future in terms of infrastructure, in terms of preparing for natural disasters, etc. With climate change, we can't make that assumption anymore. The future is not going to look the same as the past.
My recommendation for planning board members is to look beyond just the immediate steps that you need to do when you're preparing a climate change related hazard vulnerability assessment. See how your climate change policies can be holistic, i.e. it can be broad range and comprehensive. Take a look at your master plan and take that next step in evaluating how all the elements of the master plan can be put into alignment to create a much more resilient community that's less vulnerable to climate change.
I started studying climate change at this point roughly 40 years ago. And I've seen a lot of changes over that time, not only to the climate, but also to the way we're reacting to climate change. And one of the real positive changes is that planners and engineers are now taking climate change into account. And I think that this is something that's really essential going forward if we're going to be able to maintain healthy communities, sustainable communities that can avoid the most negative impacts of climate change in the future.
So when members of planning boards are looking at climate change, they have an opportunity to, through the land use policies and zoning and development regulations that are generated out of the climate change related hazard vulnerability assessment, to have an effect, an immediate effect, positive effect on their communities. And hopefully over a period of time that all the municipalities, by acting individually, will collectively, in a mosaic essentially, piecing it all together, make our state much less vulnerable to climate change related hazards and more resilient in the future.